You don't belong here." The words landed cold, sharper than the rain outside, as the security guard stretched his arm across the polished glass entrance like a barrier Maya Johnson had seen her entire life. Water dripped from the edge of her hood, sliding down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She adjusted the paper bag in her hands, the company logo already smudged from the storm, and glanced past him into the lobby where marble floors reflected gold lighting, and people who never had to check their bank balance walked like they owned the air itself. "Delivery goes to the back," the guard repeated, not even looking at her this time. Maya's fingers tightened slightly around the bag. $6.82 in her account. Rent due in 3 days. And a mother at home pretending not to be sick so Maya wouldn't worry. She didn't argue. She never argued. But she didn't step back either. Instead, she tilted her head just enough to see the elevator doors closing across the lobby, catching a glimpse of a man in a tailored navy suit, his posture straight, his expression unreadable, someone important enough that the room seemed to adjust around him. "That's my delivery," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm still clinging to her skin. The guard sighed, already annoyed. "Then you can leave it with reception." Maya followed his gaze to the front desk, where a woman barely glanced up from her screen. Another dismissal. Another invisible moment. But something in Maya shifted, subtle but real, like a switch flipping behind her eyes. "No," she said, calm but firm. He asked for it directly. The guard hesitated for half a second, just enough for her to step past him before he could stop her again. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the spotless floor, each step echoing louder than it should have, drawing a few curious glances from people who wore confidence like a second skin. She pressed the elevator button, ignoring the faint stares, the unspoken question of how someone like her ended up here. The doors opened with a soft chime, and she stepped inside, her reflection staring back at her in the mirrored walls. Wet hoodie, worn jeans, eyes that refused to look down. 30 floors up, the elevator opened to a different world. Glass walls, a skyline stretching across Manhattan like. A promise she'd never been invited to, and a conference room filled with voices sharp enough to cut through steel. Maya stepped out just as the argument inside reached its peak. "That clause protects us," a man insisted, his voice tight with pressure. "It's airtight." Another voice responded, colder, more controlled. "Nothing is airtight if it can be challenged." Maya didn't need to see him to know it was the man from downstairs. Ethan Carter. The name carried weight, even if you'd never met him. CEO. Deal maker. The kind of man who turned uncertainty into leverage and people into numbers. She pushed the door open gently, not wanting to interrupt, but the room fell silent anyway. Conversations paused. Eyes turned. And just like that, she was no longer invisible. Ethan's gaze landed on her last, slow and assessing, like she was something out of place that needed to be corrected. "You're late," he said, his tone flat, dismissive, already uninterested. Maya stepped forward, placing the bag on the edge of the table. "Traffic," she replied, simple, honest. No apology. No explanation beyond what was necessary. A few people exchanged looks. He didn't like that. Didn't like that she didn't shrink. He reached for his wallet without another word, already turning back to the documents spread across the table like she no longer existed. But Maya didn't move. Her eyes drifted over the papers, just for a second, just long enough. Words, numbers, clauses, familiar in a way she never let herself think about too long. Her fingers twitched slightly at her side. Then, before she could stop herself, she spoke. "Clause 14 contradicts your liability protection." The words slipped out clean, precise, cutting through the room like a sudden shift in gravity. Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that made people hold their breath. Ethan's hand paused mid-motion. Slowly, he looked up at her again, this time with something sharper in his eyes. "Excuse me." Maya didn't step back, didn't look away. "If the opposing counsel points it out," she continued, her voice steady, "they can collapse your entire argument in under 5 minutes." Someone at the table let out a quiet scoff. Another leaned forward, curious despite themselves. Ethan's expression hardened, the faintest hint of a smirk forming like he'd just been handed something mildly amusing. "Stick to delivering food," he said, cool and controlled, dismissing her, with a single sentence like she was nothing more than background noise. A few quiet chuckles followed. The room exhaled. Maya nodded once, not arguing, not defending herself. She turned, walking back toward the door with the same steady pace she'd walked in with. But behind her, something had already shifted. Because one of the attorneys, the one who had insisted the clause was airtight, was now flipping through the document again, slower this time, more careful. And then, barely above a whisper, just loud enough to reach Ethan's ears, he said, "Wait, she's right." The room froze again, but this time, it wasn't because of Maya. It was because the truth had just walked in wearing a wet hoodie and left without asking for permission. The silence did not break when Maya Johnson stepped out of the conference room. It followed her, stretching behind her like something unfinished, something waiting to be acknowledged. And inside that room 30 floors above the city, Ethan Carter did not move for a full 2 seconds after the words were spoken, after the quiet voice at the end of the table said, almost reluctantly, "She is right." It was not supposed to happen like that. Not in his building, not in his meeting, not from someone who had walked in soaked from the rain carrying a paper bag. Ethan slowly turned his gaze down to the document again, his fingers pressing against the edge of the contract, as if grounding himself in something familiar, something controlled. "Show me," he said, his voice low but sharp, cutting through the hesitation in the room. The attorney swallowed, flipping to the page, tracing the lines with a pen that suddenly felt heavier than before. Clause 14 references subsection 9, but subsection 9 contradicts the liability cap outlined in section 3. If opposing counsel isolates that inconsistency, they can argue bad faith interpretation. The words landed differently now, heavier, real. Ethan leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening, his mind already recalculating timelines, risks, outcomes. A $500 million deal balanced on something he had dismissed in under 3 seconds. He hated mistakes. He hated missing things. But more than that, he hated not understanding how it happened. His eyes flicked toward the door Maya had just walked through, now closed, quiet, like she had never been there at all. "Fix it," he said finally, standing up. Already moving past the moment outwardly, but internally something had shifted, something small but persistent, like a question that refused to settle. Who was she? Downstairs, the rain had softened into a steady drizzle, the kind that blurred the city into reflections and movement. Maya stepped back onto the street, pulling her hood up again, her hands already reaching for her phone to check the next order, because life did not pause for moments like that, not for people like her. The app refreshed slowly, the weak signal lagging just enough to be annoying. $12 for the next delivery. 2 miles away. She exhaled quietly, adjusting the strap of her bag as she started walking, her mind trying not to replay what had just happened upstairs, trying not to think about the way the room had gone silent, the way he had looked at her, like she was something to be corrected instead of heard. It was not new. None of it was new. But something about it still lingered, not the dismissal, not the smirk, but the fact that she had spoken at all, that she had not stayed invisible. She turned the corner, passing a storefront window that reflected her image back at her again. The same worn hoodie, the same tired eyes, but beneath that, something else, something she usually kept buried under long nights and unpaid bills. Across town, Ethan stood in his office, floor-to-ceiling glass framing the skyline like a statement of control, but his attention was nowhere near the view. The contract lay open on his desk, marked, corrected, already being rewritten by his legal team, but his focus remained somewhere else entirely. He tapped his pen once against the desk, then again, a habit he had when something did not add up. She had not hesitated. She had not guessed. She had known. And people who knew things like that did not learn them by accident. He walked to his desk, picking up his phone, scrolling through recent building logs. "I want the delivery records from this morning," he said when his assistant answered, his tone casual enough to sound routine, but there was nothing routine about the way his mind was moving now. "All of them." There was a pause on the other end. "Is there an issue?" "No," Ethan replied, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked out. Over the city, already piecing together the next step. "I just want to understand something." Hours later, Maya sat at a small table in a corner of a dimly lit apartment, a single lamp casting a warm circle of light over stacks of worn textbooks, pages marked, highlighted, folded from repetition. The noise of the city outside faded into the background as she leaned forward, pen in hand, tracing lines of text she had read 100 times before. Contract law, liability structures, case precedents. The same world she had touched for just a moment that morning, now reduced again to late nights and quiet study sessions no one would ever see. Her phone buzzed once on the table, pulling her attention away. A new delivery request. Same building. Same address. She stared at the screen for a second longer than necessary, her thumb hovering just above the accept button, her reflection faintly visible in the dark glass of the phone. Then she pressed it. Across the city, Ethan Carter looked down at the same name now displayed on his screen, the delivery confirmation blinking into place as if the universe had just handed him a second chance to answer the question he could not ignore. This time, he was not going to let her walk away unnoticed. You came back. The words were not loud, but they stopped Maya Johnson mid-step as she entered the building again, the faint hum of polished luxury surrounding her like a world she still did not belong to. This time, no one blocked her at the door. The guard barely glanced at her, already informed, already stepping aside. That alone felt strange. Too easy. Too different. Maya adjusted the delivery bag on her shoulder, her eyes scanning the lobby for a brief second before settling on the elevator. She pressed the button, her reflection staring back at her again in the mirrored panel, but something about tonight felt heavier, like the air itself was waiting. 30 floors up, Ethan Carter stood near the conference room window, his hands resting loosely in his pockets, his posture relaxed in a way that only came from control, but his mind was anything but relaxed. He had replayed that moment over and over, the exact tone of her voice, the precision of her words, the certainty. Not a guess. Not luck. Knowledge. The elevator chimed softly behind him. He did not turn immediately. You are early, he said instead, his voice calm, measured. Maya stepped out, her footsteps quiet but steady. Traffic was lighter, she replied, placing the bag on the table again, the same spot as before, like the room itself remembered her. This time, there was no meeting, no audience, just the two of them and a silence that felt intentional. Ethan finally turned to face her, his gaze sharper now, no smirk, no dismissal, just focus. You read contracts, he said, not as a question, but not fully as a statement either. Maya met his eyes without hesitation. I read a lot of things. The answer was simple, controlled, revealing nothing more than she wanted. Ethan stepped closer, just enough to narrow the space between them without crossing into anything personal. Clause 14, he continued, his tone even. You did not hesitate. Maya shrugged slightly, a small movement that masked more than it showed. It was obvious. Ethan studied her for a second longer, the kind of look that measured more than appearance, more than surface. To you, he said. Maya did not respond. She reached for the receipt, ready to leave, because staying longer meant questions, and questions led to things she had worked hard to keep buried. But Ethan moved first. Wait. The word stopped her again, softer this time, less command, more curiosity. He walked to the table, picking up a thin folder, sliding it across the surface toward her. Look at this. Maya glanced down at it, her instinct immediate. Do not engage, do not get involved, do not step into a world that does not make space for you. But curiosity had always been her weakness. She opened it slowly. A different contract. More complex. Layers of clauses, cross-references, language designed to confuse as much as protect. Ethan watched her carefully, not speaking, not guiding, just observing. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Maya's eyes moved across the page, her focus sharpening, the room around her fading into the background. She forgot the hoodie, the job, the difference between them. For a brief moment, there was only the problem. Her finger traced a line, then stopped. Section 8, she said quietly. Ethan did not interrupt. The indemnity clause conflicts with the arbitration requirement. If this goes to court, they can bypass your protection entirely. She closed the folder gently, sliding it back toward him, like she had not just dismantled another legal structure in under 60 seconds. The silence returned, but this time it carried something different. Respect. Or at least the beginning of it. Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing just slightly, not in doubt, but in realization. Who are you? The question landed heavier than anything he had said before. Maya's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted, a flicker of something guarded, something that had learned not to answer questions like that. "I am your delivery," she said, her voice calm, almost detached. She reached for the receipt again, signing it quickly, her movements efficient, practiced. Ethan did not stop her this time. Not physically, but his voice followed her as she turned toward the door. "You are not just that." Maya paused for half a second, her hand resting on the door handle, the city lights reflecting faintly in the glass ahead of her. Then she opened it. "Neither are you," she replied, and walked out before he could say anything else. The door closed softly behind her, but the weight of that exchange remained in the room long after she was gone. Ethan stood still for a moment, the folder still in his hand, the answers he had just received raising more questions than before. He had built his entire world on knowing exactly who people were the moment they walked into a room. Their value, their limits, their purpose. But she did not fit into any category he understood. Not anymore. Downstairs, Maya stepped back into the night, the city alive with noise and motion, but her mind was not on the next delivery, not on the money, not on anything practical. It was on the look in his eyes when he realized she was right. Again, she pulled her hood up, starting down the street, but something inside her felt unsettled, like she had crossed a line she could not easily step back from. Behind her, 30 floors above, Ethan Carter picked up his phone again, his decision already made before the thought fully formed. "Clear my schedule tomorrow morning," he said when his assistant answered, his voice calm, but final. "I have someone I need to meet." "People like you do not get second chances," Maya whispered to herself as she climbed the narrow stairwell to her apartment. Each step creaking under the weight of exhaustion and something far heavier, something she had not felt in a long time. Possibility. And that scared her more than anything else because possibility meant risk, and risk was a luxury she could not afford. Not with overdue rent notices stacked on the kitchen counter, not with medical bills tucked beneath them like silent reminders of everything she was holding together by herself. And yet his voice lingered in her mind, calm, certain, "You are not." Just that, repeating over and over like a question she refused to answer, like a truth she had buried too deep to acknowledge. She pushed the door open, the faint smell of old paint and reheated food greeting her as the dim light flickered once before settling, her mother's soft cough echoing faintly from the other room, grounding her instantly back into reality. This was her world, not glass towers and million-dollar deals. She set her bag down gently, careful not to make too much noise, moving toward the small table where her textbooks were still open from the night before, pages filled with notes written in tight, controlled handwriting, evidence of a life she had once been on track to live, before everything changed, before she had to choose between survival and ambition. Her fingers brushed against the edge of a casebook, lingering for just a second before pulling away, because thinking about that path hurt more than ignoring it. Across the city, Ethan Carter stood in a quiet office far above the noise, but for the first time in a long time, silence did not feel like control. It felt like interruption. Like something in his system had been disrupted in a way he could not easily correct. He had built his success on certainty, on knowing exactly where people fit, what they were worth, what they could contribute. But Maya Johnson did not fit into anything he understood, and that unsettled him more than any negotiation ever had. His assistant stood at the doorway, tablet in hand, listing off meetings, deadlines, expectations, but Ethan barely registered the words, his mind replaying the way she had spoken, the precision, the confidence, the refusal to shrink even when dismissed. "Cancel the morning briefing," he said suddenly. Cutting through her sentence, she paused, surprised. "You have the arbitration call at 9, she reminded him carefully. "Reschedule it," he replied without hesitation, his tone final, leaving no room for discussion, because this was no longer about schedules or deals. This was about something he could not ignore, something he needed to understand, and for Ethan Carter, not understanding something was not an option. The next morning came quieter than usual for Maya. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets damp and reflective, the city moving forward like nothing had changed, because for most people, nothing had. She adjusted her backpack as she stepped outside, the cold air brushing against her face, grounding her, reminding her that today would be the same as every other day, deliveries, deadlines, survival. She checked her phone, the app loading slowly, but before it could refresh, A black car pulled up beside the curb, smooth, controlled, out of place in her neighborhood where everything else felt worn and temporary. Maya hesitated, her steps slowing just slightly as the passenger window rolled down, revealing a familiar face, calm, composed, and completely out of place here. Ethan Carter looked at her like he had been expecting this moment. Like everything else in his life, it was calculated, intentional. "Get in," he said simply, not a command, but not a request either. Maya did not move, her eyes narrowing slightly, instinct immediately rising to the surface, caution, distance, control. "I have work," she replied, her tone neutral, giving him nothing. Ethan nodded once, as if he had already anticipated that answer. "So do I," he said, his gaze steady. "And you are part of it now." The words hung between them, heavier than they should have been, because they implied something she was not ready to accept, not ready to even consider. Maya shifted her weight slightly, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag, every instinct telling her to walk away, to keep things simple, to stay in the world she understood. But another part of her, quieter but persistent, told her this was not something she would be offered twice. Ethan watched her carefully, not rushing her, not pushing, because for the first time, he was not dealing with someone he could predict, and that meant patience, something he rarely needed. Seconds passed, then a few more, before Maya exhaled slowly and stepped forward, opening the car door, not because she trusted him, but because she trusted herself enough to face whatever this was. The door closed behind her with a soft, final sound, like a line had just been crossed, and neither of them fully understood what came next, but both knew nothing about this was going to be simple anymore. The city moved past them in silence, glass and steel reflecting across the tinted window as Maya Johnson sat in the passenger seat, her hands resting still in her lap, but her mind anything but calm, because nothing about this made sense. Not the car, not the man driving it, not the way her life had shifted in less than 24 hours from delivering food to sitting beside someone who operated in a world she had only ever studied from a distance. Ethan Carter did not look at her immediately, his focus steady on the road, controlled, deliberate, like everything else about him. But there was something different now, something less certain, as if he was approaching a problem he could not solve with numbers alone. "You skipped law school," he said finally, his voice calm but direct, not asking, stating. Maya turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You do not know that," she replied, her tone even. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened just slightly, not out of frustration, but concentration. "Your analysis was not theoretical," he continued. "It was practiced, refined, and specific. People do not speak like that unless they have been trained." Maya let out a small breath, her gaze shifting back to the passing city outside, because this was exactly what she had tried to avoid. This moment, this conversation, this exposure. "People learn in different ways," she said quietly, not denying, not confirming. Ethan glanced at her briefly, studying the way she chose her words, the way she revealed just enough to stay honest, but never enough to be vulnerable. "And you chose to deliver food instead," he said, not as an insult, but as a contradiction he could not ignore. Maya's jaw tightened slightly, her eyes fixed on the window. "I chose what I had to," she answered, and that was the first real answer she had given him, because it carried weight, history, something deeper than logic. The car slowed as they pulled up in front of a quiet building. Downtown, not as grand as his office tower, but still far removed from her world. Ethan parked without another word, stepping out and walking around to her side before she could open the door herself, not out of habit, but intention. Maya hesitated for a second before stepping out, her eyes scanning the building, trying to understand where he had brought her and why. "What is this?" she asked, her tone cautious. Ethan met her gaze directly. No hesitation, no performance, just clarity. "A test," he said simply. And something about that word made Maya pause, because tests implied expectations, and expectations were something she had learned to avoid. He pushed open the door, gesturing for her to step inside first. The interior was quiet, almost empty. A single long table in the center of the room with stacks of documents arranged neatly across it. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting soft light over everything. But the stillness made it feel heavier, more serious. Maya stepped forward slowly, her eyes scanning the papers, her instincts immediately recognizing the complexity even before she touched anything. Ethan closed the door behind them, the soft click echoing slightly in the quiet space. "This is a case we have been working on for months," he explained, moving toward the table. "Every angle has been analyzed, every risk calculated, and we are still missing something." Maya crossed her arms slightly, her posture guarded. "So you brought a delivery girl to fix it," she said, the edge in her voice sharper now, because she was not going to let him rewrite what she was, not without a fight. Ethan did not react defensively. Instead, he shook his head once, calm, certain. "I brought the only person who saw what my entire legal team missed in under a minute," he replied, and that shifted something, just slightly, because that was not dismissal, that was recognition, even if she did not want it. Maya stepped closer to the table, her fingers hovering over the documents for a second before she picked up the first page, her eyes moving quickly, scanning, connecting, analyzing. The world around her faded again, just like it always did when she allowed herself to step into this space, this version of herself she had tried to leave behind. Minutes passed without a word. Ethan watched her, not interrupting, not guiding, because this was the moment he needed to see clearly, not just what she knew, but how she thought. Maya flipped. Another page, then another, her brow tightening slightly, not in confusion, but focus, and then she stopped, completely still, her eyes fixed on a single paragraph. "This is not a legal problem," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Ethan stepped closer, his attention sharpening instantly. "Then what is it?" he asked. Maya looked up at him, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her expression, no distance, just clarity. "It is a strategy problem," she said, her voice steady. "You are trying to defend something that should not be defended." The words landed heavy, because they challenged more than the case. They challenged him. Ethan's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, deeper, more engaged. "Explain," he said, and Maya set the paper down slowly, stepping back just enough to see the entire table, the entire structure. "You are thinking like a lawyer," she continued, "but you need to think like the opposition." She pointed to a section on the document, her fingers steady. "If they push this angle, your defense collapses, not because it is weak, but because it is predictable." The room fell silent again, but this time it was not tension, it was realization. Ethan looked at the document, then back at her, and for the first time, there was no trace of underestimation in his gaze, only respect, growing, undeniable, and something else beginning to form beneath it, something neither of them were ready to name yet. "Then stop defending it." The words hung in the air, simple, direct, and impossible to ignore, as Maya Johnson stepped back from the table, her arms crossing again like she had just drawn a line between herself and everything on it, between herself and him. Ethan Carter did not respond immediately, but his eyes did not leave her, because no one spoke to him like that, not in his firm, not in his world, and certainly not someone who had walked in here hours ago carrying a delivery bag. But she was not wrong, and that was the problem, or maybe it was the solution. He exhaled slowly, his mind shifting, recalculating, not the numbers, but the approach, the entire structure of how he had been thinking about the case. "If we do not defend it," he said finally, his voice measured, "we lose the deal." Maya shook her head. Once, small but certain. "No," she replied, her gaze steady. "You lose it if you keep pretending it is something it is not." She stepped forward again, reaching for another document, flipping it open with a familiarity she could no longer hide. "They are not trying to win on facts," she continued, her finger tracing a section of text. "They are trying to control the narrative." Ethan watched her carefully, every word she spoke aligning with something he had felt, but not fully identified. Something just out of reach until now. "So you shift it," she said, looking up at him again. "You stop reacting, and you make them respond to you." The room felt smaller now, more focused, like everything unnecessary had fallen away, leaving only the problem and the solution standing across from each other. Ethan stepped closer to the table, his attention fully locked in. "How?" he asked, and this time it was not a challenge. It was genuine. Maya held his gaze for a second longer, then looked back down at the documents. Because answering that question meant stepping deeper into something she had spent years trying to walk away from. But she had already crossed that line the moment she opened the folder. "You build a new angle," she said slowly, her voice quieter now, but no less certain. "One they are not prepared for." She flipped another page, pulling out a specific section, sliding it toward him. "This clause," she pointed. "It is not strong enough to protect you, but it is strong enough to redirect the argument." Ethan leaned in slightly, reading, his mind moving faster now, connecting the pieces she was laying out, not as isolated points, but as a system, a strategy. "You are saying we turn defense into offense," he said, more to himself than to her. Maya nodded once. "You make them explain why they ignored this," she replied. "And while they are doing that, you control everything else." The silence that followed was not uncertainty, it was recognition, because this was not just insight, this was experience, thinking, instinct, the kind that could not be faked. Ethan straightened slightly, his gaze shifting from the document back to her. And for the first time, there was no distance left in it. No hierarchy, no assumption, just clarity. "You have done this before," he said, not asking. Maya's expression flickered. For a fraction of a second, something almost invisible, but enough, she looked away briefly, her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the table. "Not like this," she answered. And that was as close to the truth as she was willing to give. Ethan studied her for another moment, then nodded once, not pressing further, not yet, because whatever her past was, it was not something she was going to hand over easily, and pushing would only make her step back. "Stay," he said instead. The words simple, but carrying more weight than anything else he had said. Maya looked at him again, her eyes narrowing slightly. "For what?" she asked, her tone guarded again. Ethan gestured toward the table, toward the case, toward everything that had just shifted between them. "To finish this," he replied. And there it was, the offer, not framed as a job, not as an opportunity, but as something immediate, something necessary. Maya hesitated, her instincts pulling in two directions, one telling her to walk away, to keep things safe, predictable, controlled, the other pulling her towards something she had not felt in years. Purpose. She glanced down at the documents again, then back at him, measuring, calculating in her own way. "I am not your employee," she said finally, setting the boundary clearly. Ethan did not argue. Instead he nodded once. "Then do not be," he replied. "Be the person who solves the problem." The words landed differently, because they did not reduce her, they did not define her. They acknowledged something she had not allowed herself to be in a long time. Maya exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders shifting slightly, not disappearing, but changing. She set her bag down on the chair beside her. A small, almost unnoticeable action, but one that marked a decision. She was not leaving. Not yet. Ethan noticed, but said nothing, because some choices did not need to be confirmed out loud. They just needed to be respected. The room settled into a new rhythm then, one without titles, without roles, just two minds working toward the same outcome. But beneath that, something else had already begun to form, something neither of them had planned for, and neither of them fully understood yet. "You missed something." The voice did not come from Maya this time, but from Ethan, low and focused, as he leaned over the table, his finger tapping lightly against a section she had just outlined. And for a brief second, Maya almost smiled, not because he was wrong, but because he was finally playing the same game she was, not above her, not ahead of her, but with her, and that changed everything. She stepped closer again, her shoulder nearly brushing his as she followed his line of thought, her eyes narrowing slightly, recalculating, adjusting. "No," she said after a second, her voice calm but precise. "You are looking at the surface again." She reached across him, pulling another page from the stack, her movement natural now, unguarded in a way she had not been before, because somewhere between the first document and this moment, she had stopped being the delivery girl in the room and started being something else entirely, something she had not allowed herself to be in years. "Look here." She pointed, her finger steady. "This is where they will pivot when you push back." Ethan followed her indication, his mind already moving ahead, anticipating the next step. But this time, he did not interrupt. He listened, fully, completely. If you close this gap, she continued, they lose their leverage before they even realize it. The room fell into a rhythm then, a quiet intensity that neither of them had experienced in a long time, not with anyone else, because this was not about proving anything anymore. It was about solving something, building something, piece by piece, and for Maya, it felt dangerously familiar, like stepping back into a version of herself she had buried under necessity and survival. Hours passed without either of them noticing. The light shifting slowly across the floor, the city outside moving forward while inside that room. Time felt suspended, focused entirely on the work between them. Ethan leaned back slightly, exhaling as he looked over the revised structure they had built together. Not just improved, but transformed. This changes everything, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Maya did not respond immediately, her eyes still scanning the final page, making sure there were no loose ends, no overlooked details, because she knew better than anyone how quickly something small could collapse something big. It gives you control, she said finally, her voice softer now, less defensive, more certain. Ethan glanced at her again, and this time, there was no calculation in his gaze, no analysis, just something simpler, respect, real and undeniable. You should not be doing deliveries, he said, the statement direct, but not dismissive. Not anymore. Maya's hand paused slightly over the paper, just for a second, before she pulled it back, her posture tightening again, the walls returning. I told you, she replied, her tone measured, controlled. I do what I have to. Ethan stood up, walking a few steps away, giving her space, not as a tactic, but as recognition. Because pushing her now would only undo everything they had just built. That is not the same as what you are capable of, he said, his voice quieter now, but carrying more weight. Maya looked at him then, really looked at him, searching for something in his expression, something that would tell her this was just another form of control, another version of the same world she had learned not to trust, but she did not find it. Instead, she found something unfamiliar, sincerity, and that made it harder, not easier. She exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping back to the table, because acknowledging that would mean acknowledging everything she had walked away from, everything she had given up. Capability does not pay rent, she said quietly. And that was the truth, simple and undeniable. Ethan did not respond right away, but something in his expression shifted again, deeper this time. Understanding, not just of her skills, but of her reality. Something he had never had to consider before. Not like this. Then let it, he said finally, turning back toward her, his voice steady, clear. Work with me. The words landed between them, not as a command, not as a demand, but as an offer, real and immediate. Maya's eyes lifted to meet his again, her expression guarded. But there was something else there now, hesitation, not rejection. You do not even know me, she said, and for the first time, there was a hint of something more personal in her voice, something that went beyond logic. Ethan held her gaze without flinching. I know enough, he replied, and that answer was not about her past, or her story, or the things she had not told him. It was about what he had seen, what she had shown, what she could do. Maya looked away again, her fingers curling slightly against her palm, because this was the moment, the kind that changed things, the kind she had avoided for a long time. Not because she did not want it, but because she could not afford to lose it if it went wrong. The room felt different now, quieter, heavier, like it was waiting for her decision. And for the first time since she had walked into that building, Maya Johnson did not know what the right answer was. Only that whatever she chose next, there would be no going back. Say yes, and everything changes. The thought did not come from Ethan. It came from somewhere deeper inside Maya Johnson, the part of her she had spent years silencing. The part that still remembered who she used to be before survival became the only priority. She stood there for a moment longer than she should have, her eyes fixed on the table, but her mind racing through every consequence, every risk, every possibility, because nothing about this offer was simple, and nothing about Ethan Carter was something she could afford to trust easily. This is not temporary, she said finally, her voice steady but quieter than before, like she was choosing each word carefully. Ethan did not move, did not interrupt. He understood instinctively that this moment belonged to her. If I step into this, she continued, lifting her gaze to meet his, I am not stepping back out when it gets complicated. The words carried weight, not just a condition, but a warning, because she had already lived through what it meant to build something and lose it. Ethan held her gaze, his expression calm, but there was something stronger beneath it now, certainty. Neither am I, he replied, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt, just a quiet promise that landed heavier than anything else he had said. Maya studied him for a second longer, searching for any sign of inconsistency, any crack in the confidence he carried so naturally. But she found none, and that made the decision harder, not easier, because this was real, and real things could break. She exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders shifting as she made the choice she had been avoiding since the moment she walked into his building. Then I will stay, she said, simple, direct, and final, the words settling into the space between them like something permanent. Ethan nodded once, not with surprise, but with recognition, like this was exactly how it was supposed to happen. Good, he said, his tone even, but there was something else there now, something lighter, almost relief, though he would never call it that. The shift was immediate, not in the room, but in the dynamic between them, because this was no longer a moment, it was a commitment. Maya set her backpack down fully this time, not just resting it, but placing it aside, removing it from her shoulders like she was stepping into something new, something she had not allowed herself to carry in a long time. Ethan moved toward the table again, already adjusting the documents, reorganizing, refining, but this time, he did not take the lead alone. He paused, glancing at her, a silent acknowledgement that this was no longer his case alone. Maya stepped beside him without hesitation, her posture different now, less guarded, more grounded, like she had found her footing in a space she had once believed was closed. To her, "We need to restructure the opening argument," she said, her voice steady, confident, not asking for permission, not waiting for approval. Ethan nodded, agreed, he replied, and just like that, the work resumed, but it felt different now, faster, sharper, more aligned. Hours passed again, but this time, there was no tension, no distance, just focus, collaboration, and something building beneath it that neither of them addressed. The sun shifted lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the room, when a soft knock interrupted the silence. Ethan glanced toward the door, his expression tightening slightly, not in frustration, but awareness. "Come in," he said, his tone returning briefly to the authority he carried so easily. The door opened, and a woman stepped inside, professional, composed, her eyes scanning the room quickly before settling on Maya, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before it disappeared behind practiced control. "The team is ready for the briefing," she said, her voice calm, but her gaze lingered just a second longer than necessary on Maya, taking in the hoodie, the worn jeans, the fact that she did not belong in this room, at least not by the standards of this world. Ethan nodded once. "We will be there in 5 minutes," he replied. The woman hesitated, just slightly. "Should I prepare access for?" She trailed off, glancing again at Maya, not finishing the sentence. But the implication was clear. Ethan did not look at her, his focus still on the documents. "She is with me," he said, simple, direct, final, the words cutting through any uncertainty before it could fully form. The woman nodded, masking whatever reaction she had behind a professional expression before stepping back out and closing the door. The room fell quiet again. But the atmosphere had shifted, not internally, but externally, because now Maya was no longer just a presence in a private room. She was about to step into a space where everyone would see her, judge her, question her. Maya felt it immediately, the weight of what was coming, the shift from being unseen to being exposed. She looked at Ethan, her expression calm, but her eyes sharper now. "They are not going to like this," she said, not as a concern, but as a fact. Ethan met her gaze, and for the first time, there was a hint of something almost amused in his expression, not dismissive, not careless, but confident. "They do not have to," he replied, his voice steady. "They just have to be right." Maya held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, because she understood exactly what that meant, not acceptance, not approval, but results. And for the first time in a long time, she was ready to prove something, not to them, but to herself. She picked up the final document, straightening it slightly before placing it back down, her posture shifting subtly, not into something new, but into something familiar, something she had always been, but had not allowed herself to show. "Then let us go," she said, and without another word, they walked out of the room together, not as strangers, not as opposites, but as something neither of them had expected to become, a team. "Do not speak unless you are certain," Ethan said quietly as they approached the conference room, his pace steady, his tone not controlling but grounding, because he understood exactly what was waiting on the other side of that door. Maya Johnson did not respond, but her eyes sharpened slightly, her posture straightening just enough to signal that she did not need the warning. She needed the moment. The door opened, and the shift was immediate. Conversations paused, eyes turned, and just like that, she felt it, the weight of judgment, not subtle, not hidden, but clear in the way people looked at her clothes, at the fact that she was standing beside Ethan Carter instead of behind a delivery counter. A few brows lifted, a few exchanged glances, silent questions passing between people who were not used to being surprised. Ethan did not slow down, did not acknowledge the shift. He walked straight to the head of the table, placing the documents down with controlled precision. "We are adjusting the strategy," he said without introduction, his voice calm, but carrying authority that cut through the room instantly. Maya remained standing beside him, not stepping back, not shrinking, but she could feel the tension building, the quiet resistance forming before anyone had even spoken. "Based on what?" one of the senior attorneys asked, his tone measured but edged with skepticism, his eyes flicking toward Maya for just a second longer than necessary. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, just enough to include her without making it a spectacle. "Based on a perspective we have been missing," he replied, and that was all he said. But it was enough to shift the focus, because now the room was not just questioning the strategy, they were questioning her. Maya stepped forward before the silence could stretch into something dismissive, her voice steady, controlled. "Your current argument is predictable," she said, and the reaction was immediate, not spoken, but felt. A tightening of posture, a subtle shift in attention, because no one in that room spoke like that unless they had earned it, or thought they had. "If the opposition isolates the indemnity clause," she continued, her gaze moving across the table, not avoiding anyone, not challenging anyone directly, but addressing the room as a whole, "you will spend the entire case defending a position they already know how to dismantle." A few people leaned back slightly, others leaned forward, the shift small, but real, because whether they liked it or not, she was speaking their language. "So what do you suggest?" the same attorney asked, his tone sharper now, not dismissive, but testing. Maya did not hesitate. She stepped closer to the table, placing her hand lightly on the document, not claiming ownership, but anchoring her point. "You stop defending it," she said, echoing her earlier words, but this time they carried across the room. Heavier, more deliberate. "You redirect the argument to force them into a position they have not prepared for." She pointed to a section on the document, her fingers steady. "This clause is not strong enough to win on its own, but it is strong enough to shift the burden." Silence followed. But it was different now, not disbelief, but processing. The attorney glanced down at the document, flipping to the section she indicated, his expression tightening slightly as he read, not in rejection, but recognition. Ethan watched the room carefully, not intervening, not controlling, because this was her moment, not his, and he knew better than to take it away. "If you control the narrative early," Maya continued, her voice calm but firm, "you remove their advantage before they can use it." Another pause, longer this time, heavier, because the room was no longer reacting to her presence, they were reacting to her analysis, and that was harder to dismiss. One of the partners leaned forward, slightly, his eyes narrowing. "And if you are wrong?" he asked, not aggressively, but directly. Maya met his gaze without hesitation. "Then you lose faster," she replied, and a few quiet reactions followed. Not laughter, not agreement, but something in between, something that acknowledged the clarity of her answer. Ethan allowed himself the smallest shift in expression, not visible to most, but enough to signal that this was exactly what he had expected. The room settled into a different energy. Then, less resistant, more focused, Because regardless of who she was, what she wore, or where she came from, the strategy made sense. And in this world, that mattered more than anything else. We will revise the opening argument, Ethan said finally, his voice cutting through the remaining hesitation, turning analysis into action. The room responded immediately. People reaching for documents, making notes, adjusting their approach. Because once a decision was made, they moved forward. That was how this world worked. Maya stepped back slightly, not retreating, but giving space. Her role shifting from speaker to observer. But the weight of the moment remained, because she could still feel the eyes on her, not as dismissive as before, but not fully accepting either. Something in between, something that would take time. As the meeting continued, voices overlapping, strategies evolving, Maya stood quietly, her mind still engaged, still tracking every detail, but part of her remained aware of the shift that had just happened, the line she had crossed, the space she had stepped into, and the fact that there was no easy way back from it. Ethan glanced at her once during the discussion, just a brief look, but it carried something unspoken, acknowledgement, respect, and something else beginning to form beneath it, something that had nothing to do with contracts or strategy, and everything to do with the way she had just walked into a room that was not built for her and changed it anyway. You embarrassed them. The voice came low and sharp from across the room as the meeting slowly dissolved into smaller conversations, and Maya Johnson did not need to turn around to know it was directed at her, because she could feel the shift the moment Ethan stepped away to take a call. The subtle change in energy, the confidence people carried when the authority in the room was no longer watching. She turned anyway, her expression calm, unreadable, as one of the senior attorneys approached her, his posture straight, his tone controlled but edged with something less professional, something closer to irritation. You walked in here without credentials, without context, and you challenged a strategy we have been building for months, he continued, his voice low enough not to draw attention, but firm enough to carry weight. Maya met his gaze without flinching, her hands resting loosely at her sides, not defensive, not aggressive, just steady. And I was right, she replied, her tone even, not confrontational, just factual, the words landing between them like something that could not be undone. The attorney's jaw tightened slightly, not because she was wrong, but because she was not supposed to say it like that, not in this space, not to him. That is not the point, he said, his voice sharper now. The point is you disrupted the process. Maya tilted her head slightly, considering that for a second. The process was failing, she answered, and there it was again, that clarity, that refusal to soften the truth just to make it more acceptable. The attorney exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. Do you even understand what is at stake here? He asked, and this time, there was something else beneath the question, something that had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with her. Maya's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened just slightly. More than you think, she said quietly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the conversation had shifted beyond the surface, beyond the professional, into something more personal, more uncomfortable. The attorney glanced toward the door where Ethan had stepped out, then back at her, lowering his voice even further. People like you do not just walk into rooms like this and take control, he said, and the words were careful, measured, but the meaning was clear, and for the first time since she had entered the building, Maya felt it fully, not just the judgment, not just the skepticism, but the boundary, the invisible line that had been drawn long before she ever stepped inside. She held his gaze, not backing down, not reacting emotionally, just present. People like me solve problems, she replied, her voice calm but firm. And that was not just a response, it was a statement of identity, something she had not claimed out loud in a long time. The attorney's expression shifted slightly, not softened, but unsettled, because he did not have an immediate answer to that. And before he could find one, Ethan's voice cut through the tension as he stepped back into the room. Is there an issue? He asked, his tone even, but his eyes already assessing the situation, reading the space, the posture, the distance between them. The attorney straightened immediately, the edge in his expression smoothing into professionalism. No, he said quickly, just clarifying expectations. Ethan's gaze lingered for a second longer, then shifted to Maya, and in that brief moment, there was a silent question, not spoken, not demanded, just offered. Maya gave the smallest shake of her head, not because nothing had happened, but because she was not going to let this become something it did not need to be. Ethan nodded once, understanding without needing more. Good, he said, turning his attention back to the room. Then we moved forward. The authority in his voice reset the dynamic instantly. Conversations resumed, people returned to their work, but the tension did not disappear. It just settled beneath the surface, quieter, but still present. Maya stepped back slightly, giving space again, but her mind was not on the case anymore. Not fully. It was on the conversation, on the words that had been said, on the ones that had not, because this was the part she had expected, the part she had prepared for, the resistance, the doubt, the unspoken question of whether she belonged here at all. Ethan approached her a few minutes later, his expression composed, but his eyes sharper now, more focused. What happened? He asked quietly, not in front of the room, not as a public question, but as something private. Maya hesitated for a fraction of a second, then shook her head again. Nothing that matters, she replied, her tone controlled, but there was a subtle shift in it, something tighter, something more guarded than before. Ethan studied her for a moment, recognizing the change even if he did not fully understand it. It matters if it affects how you work, he said, his voice steady. Maya met his gaze, and for the first time, there was a hint of something else there, not doubt, not fear, but awareness. It does not, she answered. And that was true, because she had learned a long time ago how to separate what she felt from what she did, how to keep moving forward even when the ground beneath her shifted. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, accepting the answer even if he knew there was more behind it. Then we focus on the case, he said. And just like that, the moment passed, at least on the surface, but beneath it, something had changed, not in the work, not in the strategy, but in the reality of where she stood, because Maya Johnson was no longer invisible. And being seen came with a cost she was only just beginning to understand. You cannot outrun where you come from. The thought echoed quietly in Maya Johnson's mind as she stood near the window, the meeting behind her continuing with controlled urgency, voices layering over each other as strategies were refined, adjusted, executed. But her focus was no longer entirely in the room, not because she had lost interest, but because something deeper had been stirred, something she had worked too hard to bury. The words from earlier lingered, not because they were new, but because they had been spoken out loud in a place she had dared to step into, and that changed their weight. Across the room, Ethan Carter was leading the discussion with his usual precision, his voice steady, decisive, but there was a subtle shift in him as well. Something in the way he glanced toward Maya more often than necessary. Something in the way he adjusted his approach to include the angles she had introduced, not just as suggestions, but as integral parts of the strategy, because whether anyone in that room wanted to admit it or not, she had changed the direction of the case, and that could not be ignored. We reposition the opening argument, Ethan said, his hand resting on the table, anchoring the conversation. We control the narrative before they can establish theirs. Heads nodded around the room. Not all of them, but enough to signal movement, progress. Maya shifted her weight slightly, her arms folding loosely as she listened, tracking every detail, every adjustment, her mind still fully engaged despite the quiet tension that had settled beneath the surface. She had always been able to do this. Separate the noise from the logic, the emotion from the outcome. It was how she had survived, how she had adapted, but it did not make the noise disappear. It just made it easier to carry. The meeting stretched on, time slipping forward until the urgency softened into direction, decisions made, tasks assigned, people moving with purpose. And slowly, the room began to empty, conversations trailing off into smaller clusters, until it was just a few people left, then two, then one, and finally, just Maya and Ethan again, the silence returning, but it felt different now, heavier, more aware. Ethan walked toward the window, his hands slipping into his pockets as he looked out over the city, the skyline stretching endlessly, a reflection of everything he had built, everything he controlled, and yet, for the first time in a long time, control felt incomplete. You handled that well, he said without turning, his voice calm, but carrying something more personal than professional. Maya did not respond immediately, her gaze resting on the table, on the documents they had worked through together. It was not about handling it, she said finally, her tone measured. It was about being right. Ethan turned then, his eyes settling on her, studying her in a way that went beyond analysis, beyond evaluation. And you were, he replied, simple, direct, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Maya met his gaze, but there was something different in her expression now, something more guarded than before, not because of him, but because of everything else that had come with this moment. That does not mean it will be enough, she said quietly, and that was not doubt. It was experience. Ethan took a step closer, not invading her space, but narrowing the distance just enough to shift the dynamic again. It is a start, he said, and there was something in his voice now, something steadier, something that did not rely on outcome alone. Maya held his gaze for a second longer, then looked away slightly, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table, grounding herself again, because this was the part she did not trust, not the work, not the strategy, but the space between them, the way it was changing, the way it felt different from anything she had expected. You are not used to being challenged, she said, her tone softer now, not accusatory, just observant. Ethan allowed a small breath to escape, something almost resembling a quiet acknowledgement. No, he admitted, and that honesty, simple as it was, shifted something again. Maya glanced back at him, her expression searching, measuring, trying to understand what that meant, not just for him, but for her, for this. Then why me? She asked, and this time, the question was not about the case, not about the work. It was about something else entirely, something she had not allowed herself to ask until now. Ethan did not answer immediately, his gaze steady, thoughtful, as if he was considering the weight of the question itself, not just the words. Because you see things differently, he said finally, his voice quiet but certain. And because you do not pretend otherwise. Maya held his gaze, the answer settling between them, not as something complete, but as something real, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to explain, only something left to understand, something still forming, still undefined, and just as that silence began to stretch into something deeper, Maya's phone buzzed softly in her pocket, the sound small, but enough to break the moment. She glanced down, her expression shifting instantly, the focus returning, the reality grounding her again. She pulled the phone out, reading the message quickly, her posture tightening slightly. I have to go, she said, her voice controlled, but there was urgency beneath it now. Ethan's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. What is it? He asked. Maya hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then shook her head. Something I cannot ignore, she replied, and without another word, she reached for her bag, the same one she had set aside earlier, lifting it back onto her shoulder like she was stepping out of one world and back into another. Ethan watched her, not stopping her, not questioning further, but something in his expression shifted. Again, something deeper, something that recognized that whatever had just started between them was not simple, not contained, and not something he could control. And as Maya walked toward the door, her steps steady but faster now, one thought remained clear in both of their minds. This was not just about a case anymore, and whatever came next was going to change more than either of them had planned. Some problems do not wait for your success, Maya Johnson thought as she rushed down the steps of the building, the polished glass doors closing behind her like a quiet separation between two worlds that were never meant to overlap. The city air hit her instantly, colder now, sharper, grounding her back into reality with every step she took toward the sidewalk, her phone still in her hand. The message burned into her mind. The clinic had called twice, her mother's condition had worsened, and, for a moment, everything else faded. The case, the meeting, Ethan, all of it reduced to background noise against something far more immediate. She moved quickly, weaving through people who barely noticed her, because in this world, urgency was invisible unless it belonged to someone important. Across the street, a bus pulled up, the brakes hissing as the doors opened, but Maya kept walking, her pace faster than the crowd, because waiting was not an option, not today, not now. Minutes later, she pushed open the door to the small clinic, the familiar scent of antiseptic and quiet worry filling the air. The receptionist looked up briefly, Recognizing her, her expression softening just slightly. "They are in the back," she said gently. Maya nodded once, not slowing down, her steps echoing softly against the tile floor as she moved down the narrow hallway, her heart steady but heavy, prepared but still unready. She reached the door, pausing for just a second before pushing it open. Her mother sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders slightly slumped, a nurse standing beside her adjusting something Maya did not need to fully understand to know it was not good. "Mom," she said quietly, stepping inside, her voice softer now, grounded in something deeper than anything she had felt all day. Her mother looked up, a tired smile forming, the kind that tried to hide more than it revealed. "You came fast," she said, her voice gentle. Maya moved closer, setting her back down without thinking, her focus entirely on her. "I always do," she replied. And that was not just reassurance, it was truth. The nurse stepped back slightly, giving them space, but the weight of the moment remained, the unspoken understanding of what this meant, what it could mean. Maya's eyes moved briefly to the chart at the end of the bed, not reading it, but acknowledging it, because she had learned enough over time to recognize patterns, to understand when things were shifting, and this was one of those moments. "It is just a checkup," her mother said, as if she could read the thoughts forming behind Maya's eyes. Maya nodded slightly, but she did not respond, because they both knew that was not entirely true. The silence between them settled into something familiar, something they had navigated together for a long time. Quiet strength, quiet understanding. Across the city, Ethan Carter stood in his office, his phone still in his hand, the call he had just ended already fading from his mind, because his focus had shifted the moment Maya walked out of the room. Not because of the case, not because of the work, but because of the way she had said, "Something I cannot ignore," and the way her expression had changed when she said it. He moved toward the window, looking out over the city, but his mind was not on the skyline. It was on her, on the unanswered question of where she had gone, and why it mattered more than it should have. He was not used to this, not used to distraction, not used to uncertainty that he could not immediately resolve. And yet, here it was, quiet but persistent. His assistant knocked lightly before stepping inside, tablet in hand. "The revised documents are ready," she said, her tone professional. Ethan nodded once, but did not turn immediately. "Send them to the team," he replied, his voice steady, but his thoughts elsewhere. She hesitated for a moment, noticing the shift, but said nothing, stepping back out and closing the door behind her, leaving him alone with a question he could not ignore. Hours later, Maya sat beside her mother, the clinic quieter now, the earlier tension settling into something more stable, but not resolved. Her hand rested lightly over hers, a small, grounding connection. Her phone buzzed. Again on the chair beside her, the screen lighting up with a name she had not expected to see. She glanced at it for a second, her expression unreadable, then reached for it, hesitating just long enough to consider whether to answer, before finally pressing the button. "Hello," she said, her voice calm, but there was a shift in it, something more guarded, more aware. On the other end, Ethan's voice came through, steady, but softer than before. "Are you all right?" he asked, not as a formality, not as an obligation, but as something genuine, and that alone made Maya pause, because she was not used to being asked that by someone like him, not in a way that did not carry expectation. "I am handling it," she replied, choosing her words carefully, because that was what she did. She handled things, she carried them. She moved forward. Ethan was quiet for a second, processing the answer, recognizing what was said, and what was not. "Do you need anything?" he asked, and this time, the question was heavier, because it offered something she had learned not to accept easily. "Help?" Maya looked down at her mother, at the quiet rise and fall of her breathing, at the reality of everything she was balancing, and for a moment, she considered it, not because she wanted to rely on him, but because she understood what was at stake. But then she exhaled slowly, her expression settling back into control. "No," she said, her voice steady, final. "I will be back tomorrow." There was a pause. On the other end, not of hesitation, but acknowledgement. "Tomorrow," Ethan repeated, and though the word was simple, it carried something more, something that connected this moment to everything that was still ahead. Maya ended the call quietly, Placing the phone back down, her hand returning to her mother's, the world narrowing again to what mattered most in that moment. But beneath it, something remained, something unresolved, something waiting, because both of them understood, when tomorrow came, everything would be different again. Tomorrow decides everything, Maya Johnson told herself as she stepped back into the building. The same glass doors, the same polished floors, but nothing about this moment felt the same, because this time, she was not walking in as someone unnoticed, she was walking in as someone expected, and that changed the weight of every step she took. The elevator ride felt shorter, quieter. Her reflection in the mirrored walls no longer just a reminder of where she came from, but a question of where she was going. The doors opened, and the energy on the floor shifted almost immediately. People glanced up, some briefly, some longer, the recognition not fully formed, but present. She walked forward without hesitation, her posture steady, her pace controlled, because whatever had happened yesterday, whatever had been said, whatever had been implied, none of it mattered more than what she was here to do. The conference room door was already open, voices inside mid-discussion, and as she stepped in, the room did not fall silent this time. It adjusted, conversation slowing, attention shifting, but not stopping, because now, she was part of the equation, not an interruption to it. Ethan Carter stood at the head of the table, his gaze lifting the moment she entered, and for a brief second, something passed between them, not spoken, not acknowledged, but understood. She was here, and that meant something. "We are ready," he said, not as a greeting, but as a continuation, because this was not about introductions anymore. This was about execution. Maya stepped forward, taking her place beside the table, not at the head, not at the edge, but within it, within the space that had once been closed to her. The documents were already laid out, revised, structured around the strategy they had built together, and as she looked down at them, there was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just clarity, because this was where she belonged, whether anyone else believed it or not. The discussion resumed, sharper now, more focused, the team moving through the final adjustments. But this time, when questions arose, when uncertainties surfaced, they did not look past her. They looked at her, not all of them, not comfortably, but enough. Enough to signal a shift that could not be reversed, if they challenged the narrative early. One of the attorneys said, his tone measured, but his eyes flicking briefly toward Maya, "We will need a stronger counter." Maya stepped in before the silence could stretch, her voice steady, grounded. "You do not counter it," she said, and the room quieted just slightly, enough to listen. "You let them commit to it," she continued, her gaze moving across the table, not avoiding, not seeking approval, just presenting. "And then you expose the weakness when it matters most." A pause followed, not resistance, but processing, and then, slowly, heads nodded, not all at once, not in full agreement, but enough to move forward. Ethan watched her, not with surprise anymore, but with something deeper, something that had grown steadily from the moment she first spoke in that room. Respect, real and unwavering. The meeting progressed. Decisions finalized, roles assigned, the strategy locked into place, and as it reached its conclusion, the room settled into a quiet confidence. Not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because the path forward was clear. People began to gather their things, conversations shifting into smaller discussions, until once again, the room thinned, leaving only a few, then two, and finally, just Maya and Ethan, the silence returning, but it felt different now, not uncertain, not questioning, but complete in a way neither of them had expected. Ethan stepped closer, his hands resting lightly against the table, his gaze steady on her. "You changed the case," he said, not as a compliment, not as an observation, but as a statement of fact. Maya looked at him, her expression calm, but there was something else there now, something lighter, something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. Recognition. "No," she replied quietly. "I just saw it differently." Ethan held her gaze, the simplicity of her answer carrying more weight than anything else she could have said. "That is exactly what changed it," he responded, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to explain, only something left to acknowledge. The distance between them felt smaller now, not physically, but in a way that mattered more. The space that had once been defined by difference, by assumption, by roles, had shifted into something else, something built on understanding, on respect, on something neither of them had planned for. Maya glanced down briefly, her hand brushing against the edge of the table, grounding herself in the moment, because as real as this felt, as right as it felt, she knew better than to believe that anything this important came without complication. "This does not change everything," she said softly, not as a rejection, but as a reminder. Ethan nodded once, his expression steady. "No," he agreed, "but it changes something, and that was enough, not a promise, not a conclusion, but a beginning." Maya looked at him again, and this time, she did not look away, because whatever came next, whatever challenges waited beyond this room, beyond this case, beyond this moment, she was no longer standing outside of it. She was part of it. And as they stood there, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass, one thing was clear: this was not the end of her story. It was only the moment she finally stepped into it.